Our next speaker is Rob Lee. Rob says he's got lots of slides, so it's going to be a really short introduction. Rob Lee is the CEO and founder of Drago Security, which creates the critical infrastructure cyber situational awareness software, CyberLens. He's a certified SANS instructor with a bunch of courses here. He's a non-resident National Cybersecurity Fellow at New America, PhD candidate at King's College, London. Okay, I cut it really short.
Yeah, perfect. It's not important who I am. Let's just jump into the content. The only thing I will say is I did write a book once. It just happened to be a children's book. The title is SCADA and Me, a book for children and management. So I was in the Air Force. I was an Air Force cyber warfare operations officer. I worked in a specific intelligence agency that everyone's come to love and hate. And I found that no one quite understood the SCADA thing. So for me to try to break it down to senior leadership, I wrote it out in a comic book for them. Unfortunately, they really liked it, so then I had to keep going. But other than that, let's talk about what we're going to speak about today. So I want to hit on 3 areas. What are the ICS threats? So I figured Kevin, I saw sort of last minute the agenda, so I figured Kevin would be briefing a lot of the different ICS actual threats. So I'm going to focus on a little bit of the hype and what you have to be concerned about, because one of the biggest problems I see in any bit of research in ICS is not getting good data. We can all get good data. We know how to stand up honeypots. We know how to stand up infrastructure. That's awesome. The big challenge is what to do with it and not coming off embarrassing yourself by making some really bad analysis of good data. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll focus you on what matters. I'll end up showing you a model that might help you out with some of your research. And then I'll talk a little bit about where honeypots can help. So, to keep my sanity, I still write my little comics, so I try to pretend I'm important, but really all I am is a comic writer. But here we have little Bobby saying to Matt, are news reports required to have a standard of quality? And Matt says, well, absolutely. It's part of journalistic ethics and integrity to really research the material. And little Bobby says, well, I just found an equation that breaks that standard. And he said, well, not obviously. It says SCADA plus cyber equals no standard. And that tends to be what we see in journalism. I really like my reporters. Don't get me wrong. I have a lot of good reporters that I work with that are very, very astute. However, when we see ICS or cyber attack and SCADA or power grids or whatever else in the news, more times than not, almost everything in that journalistic report is wrong. So I want to bring some information about these to you. So let's start off with the first one, Illinois Waterhack. You may have heard this one before. Back in 2011, everyone was hyped up because it was right after Stuxnet, right? We can't get through a ICS talk without saying Stuxnet at least a couple times. Right after Stuxnet sort of became a thing in 2010, we saw that there was a pump failure in Illinois, and so everyone was like, oh my gosh, and Illinois Fusion Center put out that it was a Russian IP address found, and it was like, the Russian attack. What it actually was a contractor was on vacation in Russia and remoted in, and then just 5 months later, a pump failed, completely non-causal relationship, but everyone was so looking for that cyber event that they put out national level media about it. The next one, we have the Chattanooga APT. So Stephen Hilt, my buddy, gets to use that as his business card from now on, which is the greatest title ever. What happened is Bloomberg ended up partnering with a honeypot company. And this honeypot company stood up ICS honeypots. So first lesson here, an IP address with open ports that happen to be control system ports is not an ICS honeypot. Doesn't count. Doesn't matter. Nobody cares about that research. I will be as blunt and frank with you as possible during the talk because I got 30 minutes to do so. Nobody in the ICS community cares about your scanning level data on ICS honeypots. It's not impactful to us. It might be useful in the IT security research community. The asset owner, utility provider, don't expect to get a lot of traction with that. So they ended up standing up these honeypots and saying, look, we see all of these low interaction honeypots being scanned for ICS ports. And the #1 attacker in the world is the United States with 6,000 attacks over the last couple months. First of all, got to have a better definition of attacks. A TCP, port scan or an HTTP GET request is not an attack, especially not a control systems. Second problem with that, it was actually Stephen Hilt at DerbyCon scanning for control systems online for a presentation he was doing on stage, and they recorded Chattanooga, Tennessee as the #1 source of APTs for that. So be very careful with how you interpret your data. The next one, you'll see this one a lot. I have not managed to kill this yet. I bring this up at almost every talk I go to because it is still this myth in the community. In 2008, the Turkey pipeline, the BTC pipeline, did have an explosion. There was an attack on the Turkey pipeline. In 2008, the Turkish government came out and said it was these extremists. And the extremists came out and said it was us. And somehow, 7 years later, Bloomberg puts out a report that goes, nope, it was the Russians and it was a cyber attack. And I actually don't blame the journalists on this. I know the journalists. They're actually really great people, really smart people. I actually blame the incident responders for misleading them. The incident responders found malware in the control center network. They saw it beaconing out to a Russian IP address and said, look, there was an explosion and there was malware, therefore those are a causal relationship, which of course they weren't. It was a physical attack by extremists who blew up the pipeline, and because of a Russian IP address showing up in a control center, a news media organization put out on the national scale that the first act of cyber war was Russia attacking this pipeline. It is still believed to be true to this day. It is entirely false. The narrative is the attackers broke in through internet-connected surveillance systems, internet-connected camera systems, got into the control center, reconfigured the alarming conditions on the control systems themselves, and then two guys in hoodies and a laptop walked up to the pipeline and overpressurized it. First of all, if you have access to manipulate the control systems themselves, you don't need two guys in hoodies and a black laptop, right? You're already there. You already have access to do what you need. Second of all, the surveillance system that they said they broke into to get into the control environment was actually installed after the attack in response to the attack, so it couldn't have been the attack mechanism. All right. Next up, all right, I don't know if any of you have seen this one before, the Norse report on the Iranian cyber attacks. So Norse put out this report back in January of 2014. I get a call one morning, still active duty military at this time, 3 o'clock in the morning. Oh my God, is Iran coming? I'm like, what? I'm like, this is a weird prank phone call, man. And they're like, no, this is so-and-so on the National Security Council. I'm like, oh, a lot of people between me and the National Security Council. Don't need to understand military ranks just to know there's a lot of people, all right? So they're like, you do ICS, you're on a lot of these different reports we're querying. Is Iran coming? I'm like, not in the next 45 minutes it takes me to get to work, man. What do you actually need? And they're like, well, we just need to know right now because we're going to brief very senior levels of the government. I'm like, well, hold on. They sent me the report. It was a Norse report at the time. It later got spun up into this. The report said 500,000 attacks on industrial control systems by Iran. They listed out the IP ranges. They said, here's who you need to target, Cyber Command and NSA. These are the wrongdoers, okay? Attribution is actually really possible. It's actually not as difficult as people make it out to be, but it is not a who is lookup. All of the IP addresses were just Iranian IP addresses. That's how they figured it was the Iranian government. And they didn't tell the National Security Council, government, DOD, or anybody that what they were talking about was honeypots, not real control systems. And nobody who wrote that report had any experience with control systems whatsoever. So that's another little lesson learned, especially for honeypot research. You do not have to be an ICS expert, industrial control systems person at all, to stand up the right infrastructure, to gather the right data, to get all of the right resources. You too can get involved right now and significantly help the community. But your analysis of that data, you want to bring in somebody who knows what they're talking about with those specific systems at some point before you release a report on the national level, all right? So we ended up kicking it back. They ended up making a big deal out of it. The government said, we're done with this. Norse ended up losing a lot of contracts, may or may not have been correlated to that. If you've watched the news, Norse is also now bankrupt, may or may not be part of that. They ended up putting out this report, and here's where it gets interesting. Based off of honeypot research from Iranian IP space, which they were universities, hospitals, all these really vulnerable pieces of infrastructure that everyone always uses, They partnered with a think tank in DC, a very conservative think tank, and put forth recommendations to policymakers in DC who don't know the difference with this stuff. They just know cybersecurity experts and think tank combined together, good. Put forth recommendations that the Iranian nuclear negotiations should fail because if they succeeded, the money that they were getting and the relief that they would have would go for offensive purposes against control systems based on the Norse data. So this is another lesson learned. Your honeypot research and the research you do is going to be a small portion of whatever you do, right? It may not be your entire life, but it is a large portion of what we know about ICS research in the community. There's not a ton going on publicly. So the problem is it will be used. It'll be cited, it'll be put in reports, and you gotta be very careful with what you say because it can land up in policy leaders' laps and it can land up at the national level very, very quickly. Just as a funny little thing too, it really matters about that whole TCP versus UDP thing. One of the big SCADA systems they were talking about, the Oasis SCADA system, they identified a port being accessed and said this port represents Oasis SCADA system, which is not necessarily true anyways. But I asked the CEO of Norse, I said, was it UDP or TCP? Like, what do you mean? It matters, dude. Because it turns out it was TCP. Oasis doesn't use TCP. That port on TCP is the Symantec updater. So good job. All right. 2015 Turkey blackout. So this was another real event. 2015 Turkey had a blackout, but here's sort of where we're starting to see this hype cause and effect. Moments after the blackout, like moments, we had CNN, Bloomberg, very trusted national level media sources come out and say, we don't know what's going on, but it might be an Iranian cyber attack that caused this. I'm like, what? And they cited the Norse reports and the previous Bloomberg honeypot research and the BTC research. So they used these three stories to say this is why it's probably Iran. So we actually do know how to do incident response in ICS environments. I teach a class on it at SANS. I'm also the threat intelligence course author there. Incident response in ICS is not as mythical and mystic as people make it out to be. We actually have a lot of people who know how to do it correctly. I worked on the Ukraine case. We know how to do incident response. That being said, it takes time. And your national level leaders really care about things like power grids going dark. In the first couple hours and first couple days while the analysis is coming in, there is a heightened sense of geopolitical tension, right? Especially between border countries or conflict zones where there's already tension. So the problem is, while they're trying to figure out what's actually going on, and while your incident responders are taking the days, if not weeks, if not months, to actually figure out what's going on, you have national level media and honeypot research that's contributing to this narrative that it's some other nation state attacking another one. That increases tension just a little bit. So you still got to be careful. All right, then we have just complete misstatements that get spun out. This actually happened earlier this year. So at a tech conference in Israel, in Tel Aviv, the Minister of Infrastructures, Energy, and Water keynoted the end of the conference. And this conference was all about how Tel Aviv was really bringing it when it comes to cybersecurity research, which they are. And so he, I guess, wanted to have a splash. I can't speak to his intentions, but the minister came out and said, Silicon Valley is doing great, Tel Aviv is doing great, and we're doing so great, but by the way, we are undergoing right now the worst cyber attack in history. We have a cyber attack that's paralyzing the systems for the Israeli Electric Authority Corporation, the Israeli Electric Authority. So CNN, Bloomberg, Fox, everybody comes out. This is actually one of the headlines. This graphic ran all over the web, national level media. Israeli power grid suffers massive cyber attack. The problem, the Israeli Electric Authority is a regulatory body of about 30 computers that are no way touching the grid at all. It's an office where people talk about regulations for the grid. And the worst cyber attack in history was ransomware that someone opened up in a phishing email. So we really got to be careful because we are at a really important point in research where we are benefiting from the fact that people care. Infrastructure security, congratulations, you've got international interests. But we're also at a point where nobody has real data, right? There's very few sources of real data. So anything that gets generated gets news time. So you gotta be very careful with that. You gotta treat that with a little bit of respect, and I imagine everybody here does, but watch for it in the community because there's a lot of hype. So what are the real ICS threats? Well, incidental malware, configure, slammer, all those absolutely have done more damage than any other piece of ICS malware. Squirrels have done more damage to the power grid than Iran, China, and Russia combined, right? So we got to keep a little bit of understanding about what infrastructure owners and operators are dealing with on a day-to-day basis to see what they actually care about. We actually do care about nation-state attacks. The fact that it might be a higher low probability doesn't matter. I like the DHS a lot, but I'm about to slam them in just a moment. They are good people. However, DHS came out with an assessment recently and said, don't worry, it's possible that we'll have a disruptive attack on the power grid, but actually it's a really low probability. It doesn't matter how low the probability is, it matters about the impact of the power grid going down. So yes, we do have to protect it, even though squirrels are more common. You just can't go into a utility and say, look at my cyber data, it's the most important thing on your schedule, because it's not. So we got to keep a reasonable approach to it. The only 3 pieces of ICS malware ever to exist, supposedly there's a 4th one coming out next month, supposedly getting released, but the only 3 are Stuxnet, Havocs, and Black Energy 2. Those are the only 3 pieces of malware that are specifically ICS tailored. That's not the only threats we've seen. Too many people and too many researchers focus on malware. Malware is just the capability, right? If you have an unauthenticated VPN connection into a Windows 10 environment with PowerShell, congratulations, your APT doesn't need malware. So I will note to you, don't get hung up on your research around malware. It's really cool, really interesting, but the trend that we're seeing and the way that I think it will go is the malware will be the espionage capability like it's always been. But the true ability to impact systems is learning the control system themselves and learning how to interact with the control system to do damage. Happened in Ukraine, right? Learn those environments. The attackers in that case, and we'll walk through it briefly. I should have deconflicted with Kevin a little bit, but I wrote the report, so I'm still going to brief my slides. On the Ukraine case, they took over 6 months to learn how those SCADA distribution management systems operated before they initiated their attack. There was no malware in the control system environment. We did see direct use of Black Energy to harvest the credentials. The Black Energy modules got used directly in the business networks to facilitate that attack. However, it wasn't malware that brought down the grid. It was learning how to interact with the control systems. And I think we'll see more and more of that. So honeypot research, especially at those lower levels with the control system themselves and how attackers are interacting with them with or without malware is really, really important. Oh, I should also mention, just for researchers out there, if you look at Black Energy 2 and 3, and then you look at the Ukraine cyber attack, and then you go back and look at the German Stillworks attack and what we know about it, for anybody interested, you will see a lot of similarity. Not saying that it was Black Energy and the same attackers. I don't know. I think that would be very silly to pontificate about. But the methodology is almost identical. So it's interesting to see patterns in adversary activity. All right, so little Bobby here. We need more scalable, cloud-based threat intelligence analytics and automated big data endpoint security solutions. Matt says, you have no idea what you just said, do you? Nope, I read it out loud and I got invited to speak at a conference. I figured if I told 2 more people, I'd be a security expert. Matt says, sound about right. You can go to a lot of security conferences and talk about ICS all day long and be the ICS security expert in that conference bubble. Be careful, there are a lot of people who actually know control systems and will call you out very commonly in slides in front of other conferences. So what I would note to you is we have one of the most awesome communities, in my opinion. Control system and infrastructure asset owners and operators, awesome people. Be very willing to learn, though. Default password use in a SCADA environment. Sounds hilarious. Gonna ping off of Lance here about why these kind of things occur. We've had more impact from an operator forgetting his password and not knowing how or not being able to control the actual control systems than we've had Russia APT breaking in and using a default password. So the risk to the ICS is more along that line than it is along things we care about. So all I'm saying is we need help in the community. Your research is important, but be part of the community. Attacker objectives, there's a lot more than just stealing off data. Things about losing control, losing view, losing safety systems. Your in-map scan will not find the passive safety systems in a control system environment. They won't find the safety instrumented system that is holding the release valve so that if something overpressurizes, it actually just doesn't do anything. So there's a lot of things you need to learn about the physical control systems themselves, not just the cyber components. In terms of difficulty, I will admit there's problems, right? We've got to do better in the ICS community. Compromising security today is very trivial. But actually doing physical damage or disruption or anything longer than a couple hours is extremely difficult. And it gets way too much attention on the actual prioritization of resources. To actually do a high confidence attack and actually go forward and have a very damaging or destructive mechanism takes months, if not years, of research to do by very, very talented teams. Finding a honeypot or finding a control system on Shodan and linking in, no problem. You can compromise ICS security today, we gotta fix it. But to actually do the worst things that we care about in the community, it's not as easy as people make it out to be. It is very difficult. So a model I'll put forward to you, I wrote over with Michael Asante, and I wrote this paper over at the SANS Institute titled The ICS Cyber Kill Chain. It's adapting the kill chain that you all know, love, or hate, and looking at it from the ICS perspective. Because all that first stage stuff is just that, first stage. Reconnaissance, weaponization, getting access, all of that is just the starting place to doing a high confidence destructive attack. So what I would recommend to you when you're doing your honeypot research, I hate to see all the data that gets highlighted on reconnaissance. It's useful research, it's really not actionable. I can't use it immediately, right? Most honeypot research at best gets down to the first stage of exploit, but it doesn't get that second stage of exploit. It doesn't get the follow-on capabilities, the module loading. It doesn't get the good stuff. So try to get that good stuff. But really, if you want to do good ICS research, it's in that second stage. After the adversary has already learned the environment, develops out a capability, comes back into the environment, that capability might just be their knowledge set of how to interact with that SCADA environment or that DCS environment. They're going to test it at some point, right? You're not going to have a multi-million-dollar operation that you're running to bring down a power grid and just wing it. Not going to happen. Just as a last tangent, I really hate when people tell me what the APT will or will not do. First of all, it's not China. It's like 30 different teams in China. It's not the NSA. There's a bunch of them in there, right? There's a lot of different teams. And also, this is the one place in the community I actually get on like a little soapbox about it. How many of you have ever been the APT? Anybody ever been on offense? Anybody? Probably nobody that's going to raise their hand. Maybe one or two people here. Most people talk all day long about what the APT will or will not do or what they intended because they read the logs. They have no idea. I will position to you that if you've not actually been on offense, and I'm not talking red team, I'm not talking pen testing, I'm talking taking down infrastructure in foreign countries, you probably don't know what the actual mission requirements are. So we have a lot of defender narratives about how advanced and innovative the adversary is. I hear this all the time. The adversary is out-innovating the defender. That's crap. Defense is sexy. It's getting better. We're seeing a lot of research in this area, and we're getting good at it. The problem is we also have a lot of low-hanging fruit, and the adversary is going to take care of that phishing email all day long because they can. I will tell you from when I did work offense, most of my career was defense, patterning out nation states, breaking into critical infrastructure. It was exciting work. When I did work offense, I will tell you that there was no bonus points for looking good in the Kaspersky report. All right, think about that for a second. Nobody was like, how do we look flashy? Everyone was like, dude, I've got like 30 more things to do today. How do we get on in my life? So there is an opportune aspect to being basic and just being successful. All right, so let's take that Ukraine case real quick and look at it because it was pretty interesting. If we pattern it against the kill chain, phase 1 and 2 that I talked about, the paper's out there for anybody that's interested, we'll see all the things that Kevin so eloquently went through. We had the phishing emails that dropped into the environment themed with ICS-themed environments. When they targeted oil companies, they were themed with oil. When they're targeting energy companies and electric companies, they were targeted with that. Black Energy 3 dropped into the environment. Once it dropped in the environment, it harvested off credentials for the VPN accesses. The adversaries then use those VPN credentials to go into the control system environment itself, which was separated off from the business network. When they went into the environment, they spent 6 months inside those different environments, 3 different Oblanergos, to learn the environments, to do the asset discovery, to figure out the data flows, to try to determine how they were implementing their SCADA DMS. The SCADA distribution management system, the DMS, there were 3 different ones. 2 you'd probably only find in Ukraine, 1 you would find anywhere in the world. So they learned the environments, and when it got time for the attack and they executed the attack, it was just like Kevin went down the line, right? There was the remote desktop assistance to bring out the HMI, open up the HMI, lock out the operators. There was the telephone denial of service. There was the kill disk module to delete the logs, all that good stuff. Here's the only thing I want you to take away from this. All the stuff inside that second phase None of it was malware caused the attack. Kill disk may have amplified it, telephone attack may have, caused some confusion, but everything there was actually just learning the environment. So that's what I want you to get in Honeypot research. So we have little Bobby here. Is it unfair that China always gets blamed for computer breaches? Yes, other countries have same or similar activities. We have to keep an open mind and be very critical of the data. Okay, so which country is most responsible then? China. All right, so you may find something very obvious. Don't write a NORSE report and tell the National Security Council on it immediately, but don't be afraid to come to an obvious conclusion. Just actually go through the data appropriately and make sure it's correct. All right, so here's something I want to highlight to you again on where honeypots can help. These are stats from the ICS cert. Everyone always quotes them. I hate them. I love the ICS cert. The stats themselves are off. Here's why. Everyone always talks about how business DMZ is the #1 target and spear phishing is the #1 target. Wrong. Unknown is the #1 infection vector with 110 cases of the cases the ICS cert saw, which is a subset of the actual cases that happened last year. Business level DMZ is where all the endpoint solutions and AV and IDSs and all this stuff are, where we have visibility. Your big threat intelligence companies that come out, like Kaspersky and all those other ones that do good research, what do? They read off of customer data as if they were honeypots. They have all the endpoint security solutions to tell them what's happening. We don't have those connected back up to the internet in the ICS. So we're flying blind. We don't know what's going on in the internal control system networks. Having done incident response in many of these facilities, the control system networks in most companies are not an awesome place to be in. Even though it's a static environment and it's a great hunting ground, you will find that there's a lot of adversary activity. So the ICS cert metrics to me tell one story. We don't know the real scope of the problem. We don't have the keys to success in those facilities, and there's cultural and technical challenges to mitigate that. That's where honeypot research can really help, because as you go and actually implement a real facility and structure it out so that it's not just a control system showing up on Shodan, but a mimic of an infrastructure site with a control system network down below, that data that you will get trumps most of what we have in the community. So we actually do need a lot of this research. I liken it to the Mariana Trench, right? There's a lot of crazy stuff down there that we just don't know about. If we go looking, we will find it. I know of a number of APT actors that we are still not hearing about, specifically because nobody's looking in those networks. One recommended approach as I wrap up here, I'm trying to do all this in like 30 minutes. As I wrap up here, one recommended approach, stop thinking about control systems showing up on Shodan. Take an infrastructure project. Go Google, right? Find out that in Africa they're going to stand up some hydropower facilities. Go stand up infrastructure that mimics that. Web front end site, business network, control systems down below. Put out some fake articles if you want about the site that you have. Misspell the name by one letter. Your APT is still somewhere between the age of 18 and 28. They make mistakes, okay? They will still find it and they'll go after it. This whole like APTs wouldn't be fooled by honeypots is stupid because it happens. I promise you, you've probably seen a lot of it. Just don't make obvious mistakes. If they do a check and it's a VMware running for a control system, obviously they're going to say that's not true. Another recommended approach, look for your conflict zones, where you have South Sea of China, where you have Ukraine and Russia, where you have US and anywhere. Look for your conflict zones and try to mimic out infrastructure there, because we won't see a lot of attacks that go on because there's not a lot of motive to do it outside of a conflict zone. There's a lot of motive on espionage and military planning, not a lot of motive on actually starting a war. So look for the espionage activity. Look for the military planning activity. Go to the conflict zones and you will see it. Stand up infrastructure using cloud-based resources and proxies down if you need to. Whatever it is, make it look real. Pattern it out on new projects where your actors are trying to get a foothold, or pattern it on conflict zones where they need to based off of intelligence requirements. Get the whole picture. I'm wrapping up here. Remember that I linked you here to a presentation done by Kyle Wilhoit, who's done some amazing ICS honeypot research. What he did that I liked was it wasn't just a VM, it wasn't just a control system. He built out the full network so that he could see that phase 1 and phase 2 of the kill chain approach. Get the whole picture. I also put in here, because these will be available afterwards, some resources you can use. Phoenix Contacts, Somatic Step 7 1200 systems, and Micrologics are all very cheap. You can get some physical hardware. It's not too expensive to do so. If you're interested in learning about PLCs, the learningpit.com is like a 1990 site that's still working and still awesome, and it'll teach you everything you want to know about ladder logic and little control systems. If you want to get some more advanced training, sure, we do it at SANS, but I'm talking about on a budget. Next, look for projects that are already done. Don't repeat the wheel. Gaspot and SCADA Honeynet, Digital Bond and Kyle Wilhoit, already out there. Go take a look at it. It's a modification of Honeypot to actually look for some ICS stuff. And then, of course, always do the simple checks like Honeypot or not on Shodan to make sure you don't get caught by simple mistakes. With that, I will end my very lightning fast presentation and say, little Bobby said, Matt, an expert just told me I have to change my security approach. Matt says, well, who called him an expert? Well, he did. Well, experts are actually recognized by peers in their field, not by themselves. Little Bobby says, yeah, but it also said so in his Twitter bio. Matt said, even worse. So even though I will stand up here and pontificate and tell you all these great things and wonderful things about my opinion, they're still my opinion. Please go do your own research. There is so much misinformation when it comes around ICS attacks, things that happened, things that didn't happen, ICS research itself. You have to get smart on all of this to make it effective. With that, thank you so much.